Welcome everyone. My name is Paul Mitchell and I'm delighted to welcome you to this short interview with Professor Jacqui Close on the subject of hip fracture registry planning and funding. Hi, Jacqui.
Hi, nice to talk to you, Paul.
Splendid. Well, let me just give you a little background. Jacqui is a professor and consultant geriatrician at the Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney and clinical director of the Falls, Balance and Injury Research Centre at Neuroscience Research Australia. Critically, from the hip fracture perspective, Jacqui is the co-chair of the Australian and New Zealand Hip Fracture Registry, along with Professor Ian Harris, her orthopaedic surgeon co-part, and the co-chair of the AZHFR Hip Fracture Registry Working Group. So Jacqui has an immense amount of experience in this field to share with us. We're going to ask some questions of Jacqui today about registry planning and funding. So my first question, knowing that the ANZ Hip Fracture Registry had all started a decade ago in 2011, what were the key steps in the plan to develop the AZHFR?
I guess the first step, Paul, and you were at that meeting in November 2011, was people who believed that hip fracture care could be better, bringing people together with a common aim. On top of that, a belief that the registry was one mechanism whereby we might be able to effect change. So people brought together thinking hip fracture care could be much better, and actually the registry, based on the work that the UK had done, probably seems to be a pretty good vehicle for driving that change agenda. So if you haven't got the interested clinicians there around the table to start with, you might as well pack your bags and go home. That's where it starts from. Everything evolved from there. I guess after that, we set up the steering group. And it was also very much about having that bigger picture in mind. And I think the UK did that very well. Yes, it's great having interested clinicians, but actually your end goal is to set up was binational registry for us. How do we go from where we are now in October, November 2011 with a few people all thinking it's a great idea? How do you actually then turn that into a deliverable, which is a binational registry? And so right from the very beginning, I think having that bigger picture in mind was critical, and taking direction from people who know better than we do in terms of how do you make change happen within your health context and health system. So right from the very beginning, we took advice from clinicians, but clinicians in very senior management roles, saying, actually, if we're going to make this fly, what sort of things do we need to do? And we were told very clearly from the very beginning, if you want to have standards in this country, you have got to have a guideline that is, for us, NHMRC endorsed. It'll be different in other countries. So we did that not because we thought it was a great idea. We were told that we needed that to get to the next stage, which was the standards. I think in terms of the work with the Australian Commission, that was a really good move in terms of they had carriage of our national standards, and they also have influence where clinicians don't have influence, and they were able to deal with all the jurisdictions and all the politics and policies related to developing standards and guidelines in this country. So working with them, number one, was a pleasure, and number two, having a standard that comes from the group that has carriage of national standards in a country was absolutely critical for us. And the other positive bit about it, of course, is we did it with New Zealand partnership right from the outset, and we remain partners with New Zealand in all of this. So I think it's just starting small, engaged clinicians who think we can do better, but having the bigger picture in mind right from the very beginning, because we're in this for the long haul.
Absolutely. Well, one question pursuant to that very useful insight is, as you know, at the time I was a member of the board of Osteoporosis New Zealand, the advocacy group. How important or not do you think it was to have Osteoporosis New Zealand and Osteoporosis Australia at the table from the get-go on this initiative?
I think at the very beginning it was very much interested clinicians. But as you started to think through how we're going to turn this into something bigger that is generalizable, sustainable, it became apparent to us that actually we needed all the key professional organizations involved in hip fracture care on board. And so Osteoporosis New Zealand and what was formerly known as Osteoporosis Australia were two of those key stakeholders to have involved. And as you'll recall, we also got a small pot of money as well from them in terms of supporting the website development. It may only have been a small pot of money, but at that time we were very grateful for any money. And if it, you know, anything just to set up the website, that was greatly valued.
And a final question on those planning aspects before we come on to the subject of money is I think that Australia and New Zealand has done an excellent job with regard to facilities level audits. Would you like to talk to our viewers a little about the importance of facilities level audits coming before patient level audits?
So the patient level audit absolutely involves a bigger investment in time and energy. Most hospitals, if you talk to them, they will be happy to provide you with information, regardless whether they're signed up to the registry or not. They'll be happy to provide you with information about what goes on at that hospital level, what systems and processes they have in place. And for us, that's really useful information to use. And so right from the very beginning, all the public hospitals in Australia and New Zealand that operate on hip fracture patients, they were willing to provide a relatively small amount of information, but allowed us to see what systems and processes existed across the two countries. And by virtue of the fact we've been collecting it for every single year, we now have a wealth of information, and we can see things changing now over time, policies, pathways, protocols, which is fantastic. And you don't need the patient level data to be able to say, actually, something's happening at a system level. And it's a good thing, whatever it is that's happening, because things look like they're getting better. The patient level data collection, of course, is more labor intense, and we've still got a few hospitals to get on board.
Yep. No, thanks very much for that. So then to the subject that everyone will be interested in, money. Now, AZHFR has come a very, very long way, and it's always been a very lean ship. Would you like to tell us how it all started again back in 2011? Where did the initial money come from, and then what happened next?
Well, let me assure you, there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It was small pots of money, $5,000 here, $5,000 there. Then, fortuitously, the Bupa Health Foundation put out a call for grants, which fitted with what we were trying to achieve, very much implementation type work, quality improvement activities. So we put in for a grant, and we're fortunate enough to get that. And that was an important, I mean, it was $400,000 at the time. And that's a significant amount of money in terms of going from nothing to having money to actually do something with. We use that predominantly to develop the guidelines, to put in place the IT support, develop the minimum common data set, and then have a process in place for our steering group to meet. And of course, in those days, we were allowed to meet face-to-face. So it supported face-to-face meetings of the steering group. And that they were important relationships to build right from the very beginning. But, you know, 400,000 doesn't go very far. So we've had to do the hard yards and had our cap out, begging, borrowing, no stealing. We went to the Commonwealth government and the health departments to get support for it. Their response to us was very much, well, actually, what are the states and territories contributing? So we pretty much have had to get sign up from the states and territories for us to be able to get Commonwealth support. But at the moment, we've got sort of 50-50 support from states and Commonwealth. But I should make it clear, we do not have sustainable funding at this point in time. Australia's still trying to work out how it funds registries longer term. So we know that we are still vulnerable and still have to keep going in terms of ensuring we secure funding longer term. And it's no different with New Zealand, as you know, Paul. So their funding systems are different, but likewise, my equivalent colleagues in New Zealand have had to do the hard yards in terms of securing funding. Now, both countries have been successful in terms of the registry hasn't stopped, and we haven't had to say, actually, we've run out of money, we can't go. But it'll be different in every country. But if you're waiting for the pot of money to get started, it won't happen.
Yep. No, absolutely, absolutely right. No, I agree with that. So that's very useful insights for our colleagues elsewhere. So a couple of final questions, really, three. Reflecting on those early days, if there were some specific critical steps that if they were deleted from the process, that means the progress that has been made wouldn't have been made, what were those critical steps, if there's a handful of things?
I think the biggest one was actually being able to have a national clinical care standard.
Right.
Because interested clinicians pushing a clinical agenda is not normally sufficient to change a national conversation. Whereas having a national clinical care standard pushed out there into the system, not just to the clinicians, but to the managers and to the people who are responsible for funding and service provision. I think that was probably one of the most important things that we did. And by working with the Commission, we've ensured that the quality indicators that match the standards are captured in the registry. So that's probably the thing that I think we really did get right. Appointing a really good registry manager. That's easier said than done, and you certainly need the resources to be able to do that. But having somebody who's got a good understanding of ethics and governance, so every country will be different in terms of its ethics and governance requirements, but having a manager who really has got a firm grasp on all of that, but at the same time is able to interact with all the sites who are contributing data. So we have been very fortunate with our registry manager. So they will be the two things I think we really did get right. Yeah.
And then with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything along the way that in retrospect you would have done differently?
I think we learned from the UK experience, and you watch the UK experience where they kind of set up the registry first, and then the standards kind of came later, and the guidelines, they would start off with the standards, the blue book, but it evolved in a slightly different way. I think we decided, well, we're going to structure it systematically. We're going to have the guidelines that inform the standards will then inform the quality indicators, and the registry will collect the data. So I think we kind of got that order right. If it was something we were to do differently, we still need to get all the hospitals on board, so we're not there yet. We're getting there. Maybe more meaningful consumer engagement. So we certainly have consumers involved, but the stories from the consumers are very powerful. And they just remind us as to what this journey is. We're very acute focused still. I think in terms of meaningful outcomes for older people should be telling us what the meaningful outcomes are, not time to surgery. Yes, it does impact on outcomes, but there are other things that we probably should be embracing in terms of more meaningful outcomes for older people. And interestingly, I think when it comes to funding and publicity, actually having a real life story is so much more interesting than listening to a clinician talk about a quality improvement project to increase the numbers of nerve blocks, etc. And where we have had publicity over the years for the registry, it has always been aligned to a patient story. So people like patient stories, politicians like patient stories. It makes it much more meaningful. So I think we probably could have done more work in terms of our consumer engagement component, but we're not stopping. So that's something for us to think about going forward.
Yeah, excellent. So a final question then, really, what advice to wannabe co-chairs of a national hip fracture registry out there would you offer? You've lived this for the last 10 years. It's been a big job. If there are a handful of nuggets of advice that you would offer colleagues, what are they letting themselves in for?
For me, so I come at it from a geriatric medicine perspective. Having somebody on the journey with me from orthopedics has been absolutely critical. So that partnership, there are a lot of important stakeholders in this field, but on the whole, the two most invested in terms of day-to-day provision of care is orthopedic surgery and geriatric medicine. And I'm well aware in many countries there are very few geriatricians, but you really do have to have your colleagues in orthopedic surgery on board and a belief from that specialty that actually we all could be doing things better. So that was number one for me. Number two, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. If you're signing up to it, you're signing up to it for, I'm not signing up to life, but it is a marathon. You're going on a journey, and there will be ups and downs along that journey. And trying to get people engaged, keeping your minimum common data set to a minimum, encouraging people to start small. If you can't manage to capture the data on all your hip fracture patients, that's fine. Just do alternate ones or every fifth one, but you've got to start somewhere. So just starting small, have the bigger picture in mind, and recognize that for all of us, this sort of change agenda takes a long time.
Absolutely. So to conclude, as you know, having played a leading role and been co-chair of the AZHFR Hip Fracture Working Group, this HFR toolbox is being published together with this new YouTube channel. What would you hope people can get out of this document, where we've tried to distill colleagues around the world's experience of setting up these registries?
I hope people feel that they can come to it, open it, and listen to bits of it, of course, now as well, and realize that there's others have gone there before and done some of the hard yards. So please, if you're reading it and think about setting up a registry, learn from those that have gone before, learn from the successes, but also learn from the things that they regret or think that they could have done differently. And I know from the registries across the world that I'm linked up with, or the people that are running registries, every one of them will be more than happy to share their experience, to be called and said, actually, I'm trying to set up something here. What would you suggest? I think that's the beauty of hip fracture registries across the world at the moment, is that the people that are running them want to see them in other countries and are happy to help where they can. We do not have inside knowledge of the health system context in every individual country, but there's a heap of stuff that we have an understanding of that we'd be more than happy to share. So please don't reinvent wheels if you're going to set up a hip fracture registry. There are lots of us really happy to help where we can.
Well, that's a perfect conclusion to this short interview. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Jacqui Close. And just to everyone listening out there, you'll see the web link to the Hip Fracture Registry Toolbox, and there are a bunch of other talks. Please take a look at those, and as Jacqui said, connect with the individuals that have done this work before to save you time. So thanks very much, everyone, and thank you, Jacqui.
Thanks, Paul.